Hello, folks, and welcome back. So we've just seen the DOM, and we've seen that the DOM is a tree view of objects, or a tree of objects, we could say, representing the HTML in our web page. So what we're going to do now is use some JavaScript to interact with the DOM. So we mainly in this section, we're going to use JavaScript to inspect the DOM and to essentially grab hold of elements that are in our web page. So how can we do this? Well, first of all, I can do this directly in the console. So I could write in here document, and then I can write dot. And then I've got a bunch of options here, like down here. If I scroll down, lots of stuff going on in here. So one thing I'm going to look at in particular here is going to be something called query selector. If I just run that and hit enter, I get the following. I get f query selector and then native code. So this is telling me that document.querySelector, this f means it's a function, and native code means that we can't see its implementation. It's just been written for us, but this is a function. And what does this function do? Well, let's see what happens if we invoke it. So document.querySelector, invoke that. Cool. Failed to execute query selector in document 1, argument required. That's a pretty good error message. It's saying that if I invoke query selector, I need to pass an argument into it. Cool, so let's do that. So pass in a string, because I know it takes a string, but we could look at the documentation for that. So, and let's just put in here h1. Cool, and hit enter. Cool, and what we're getting here is an object in the document object model. We're getting this h1 heading over here. If I click on it, see, it's the h1 that was over here. Cool. So document.querySelector must be going into the DOM and finding the h1 element. Okay, what happens if we change this and made this h2? Indeed, what we're getting here now is the albums object within that DOM tree. Cool. Now then, if I change this one more time, and this time I say document.querySelector asked for a h3 heading. Going back to our HTML document over here, the initial HTML in the page, there's a h1 heading, there's a h2 heading, but no h3. So when we try to find that element, we're going to get null. Awesome. So then, digging a bit deeper, can we inspect this h1 in a little bit more detail? So if I do something like this, can I store this in a variable called h1? Document.querySelector, cool, h1, like so, cool. And I can reference h1 as a standard variable. Okay, so you might be thinking, what data type is this? So if I do type of h1, you can still see that this is a JavaScript object, okay? And we'll see more about that in just a moment. So I just want you to pause and reflect on what we've done here. We've essentially gone to this thing called document, which is a global object within our browser, gone to query selector, which is a property on that document object. And this is a function, and query selector is a function that's going to allow us to query the DOM and access specific objects, or sometimes referred to as nodes, within that DOM tree. Awesome. So you might be thinking, well, we've got in our HTML page here one h1, that's fair enough, and a h2 here, but within our unordered list, we've got multiple li elements. So what's the behavior going to look like if we were to query for li elements or for list elements? But let's try that. So query selector for li, If I run that, I get only one back, which is interesting. So it's returning just one element to me. And I'm getting here Pablo Honey. So it seems to me that the behavior of query selector is to return first list element that appears within the DOM tree. Cool. Now then, if I like try to store this in a variable, so let's call this first album. Whoops. It's difficult because I'm not doing it in VS Code. So let's do that again. Const first album. I'm going to assign that to be document.query selector. And then li once more. First album. If I do first album and then do a dot, we're going to see actually here we have got a JavaScript object and we've got a bunch of properties, in fact, many properties that we can inspect in here. So one of these in particular is going to be called inner text. This is a super useful one to bear in mind. So we can do first album but inner text, and lo and behold, this evaluates to being a string. So remember we were saying before with DOM. DOM is a tree of objects. So each one of these things is an object or a node with a bunch of properties. And we can use JavaScript to query the DOM to access these elements. Awesome. So then finally, before we leave this behind, we want to think about, well, how can we access multiple items? Would it be possible, for example, to get a collection or a list of all the li elements within the page? And indeed, this is possible. So slight variation on what we were doing just then. If we do document.query selector all, notice that this is a slightly different name for this function now, document.query selector all, and this, instead of returning a single item, this is going to allow us to access multiple items. So we're going to use li, and if I run that, lo and behold, I get this data structure called a node list, which is specific to the Chrome browser data type, and now we get this bunch of LIs like so, and it's indexed, zero indexed as with an array. So you might be thinking, is node list an array? Well, it looks like an array, but it may have some additional features that are not available on a standard JavaScript array. Let's test that out then, shall we? So like if we do document, so let's call this list of albums, documents dot query selector all, and let's get all of the list elements again, and let's do albums. And can we do for each? Or let's do a for of loop because we've not used for each. So for const of albums. Console log album. Oh dear, lost my loop. There we go. For const album of albums. Indeed. So we can iterate through this list of LIs just as we would with an array, and you see we get printed that out each time. If I like do that loop again, let's do album.inner text. Awesome. So we can loop through and then look at the inner text of each album. And indeed, I could do something like this. Documents, query selector, li. And then I could map. So I could call map on this, and I could say, for every li that I have, do turn li dot inner text. So let's just summarize what this is doing. So we're creating a new variable called album titles, and we're assigning it to be go fetch the list items for me, please. Go map through them, and for every li that you have, return li dot inner text. Cool, interesting. We're getting a type error here. Document.querySelector.map is not a function. So we're going to see how we can resolve that in the next video. Okay, see you very shortly.